Welcome back to the Space Salvi Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin with Bobby Mixa. Bobby, how are you?
Good, Andrew. Good to be with you again.
Good to be with you too. And I'm excited about today's guest. We've had a great string of guests in the short life of our podcast so far, and today promises to be as good as the previous ones. We're joined by Kenneth Craycraft, who is a lawyer, a moral theologian. He went to law school at Duke and got his PhD at Boston College. And nowadays he teaches at Mount St. Mary's Seminary and School of Theology in the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. We're here mostly today to talk about Ken's new book, which I'm holding up for our viewers. Our audio-only listeners won't be able to see it, of course. But the book is called Citizens Yet Strangers, Living Authentically Catholic in a Divided America. Ken, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm good, Andrew. Thank you. Thanks for having me, and I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, well, we're really glad to have a chance to meet you face to face. You're one of the many friends that we know via social media, and we write for some of the same publications and have some of the same friends. But one of the blessings, I think Bobby would agree, that we've experienced having our podcast and our institute so far is the friends that we're making and kind of putting faces with names and getting to know people. So we're really happy to get to know you today.
As am I, and it's similar. I've enjoyed your podcast and enjoyed getting to know you through Twitter and other social media platforms. So this is a special treat to finally get together today.
Yeah, I think Bobby and I both really enjoyed having a chance to read your book. And the thing that jumps out at me first, and maybe we can start here, is something that Bobby and I have talked about and written about. And something that we're interested in and focusing on here at the Space Salvi Institute is the identity of American Christianity and sort of its relation to the culture. And now all three of us are Americans. Ken, you and I live in America. Bobby now lives in Poland. But something that Bobby and I talk a lot about is we're interested in the marks of Christianity in Europe, even though Europe is such a secular culture to such a degree from the perspective of America. But one of the reasons we're so interested in that is we're interested in reconnecting with, I hesitate to use the word roots, but I like to use the word mark, like Pierre Menant does, because Christianity, and very much including Catholicism, in many respects is more American than Christian in a lot of ways. And something that we're interested in doing is kind of speaking back to our countrymen with a little bit of a different message about our faith and the culture. So your first chapter really couldn't be a more perfect starting place for us, because the topic of your first chapter is essentially that American Catholicism is liberal Protestantism. So I'll just throw it to you and just hear your perspective on that. There's a lot of good stuff in that first chapter.
Yeah, well, that's a really good introduction, actually, to the first chapter, and I have a great deal of sympathy with the project that the Space Salvi Institute has announced and what you're pursuing, because I think there's something to that. If you just take the institutional memory of Europe, it obviously is a different kind of institutional slash ecclesial or ecclesiastical memory of Europe is a lot different from that of the United States, obviously for all kinds of historical reasons. And so I think there's something to what you're talking about, especially because America, and as I say in the first chapter, is liberal and it's Protestant, and therefore virtually everyone in America is liberal or Protestant. And I've had a lot of fun both with when I wrote the book, that the first sentence of that first chapter, and it's got a lot of comment when I've had interviews about it, because I say in the very first sentence that we Catholics in America are liberal Protestants before we are anything else. And one of the things that we have to understand, and what I always hasten to do, is to define what I mean by liberalism, so it's not understood to be a description of the political left in America, or what's usually identified as someone who is in the Democratic Party or Democratic Party sympathies. What I mean, of course, by liberal is classical liberalism as founded, at least in the English tradition, in the 16th, 17th century by Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and others, which was adopted by the framers of our constitutional system, and therefore it encompasses everyone on the political spectrum in the United States, from the far right to the far left. They're all liberals. or I should say, we are all liberals, because liberalism, in that sense, is what we all agree on, and I call that liberalism a moral anthropology. That basic moral anthropology of liberalism is the moral anthropology upon which the United States is founded, and it's both baked into our constitutional structure and our founding documents and our founding ethos. And in turn, of course, it has the effect of educating us in liberalism as we grow up to be Americans. Now, there are all kinds, of course, of historical anomalies and historical exceptions. We can talk about the immigration from the early 19th century and the impact that it had. In fact, I talk about a little bit that in my book. And secondly, we're all Protestant. And what I say in the book is that the way that I use liberalism, as I just defined it, basically defined as radical individualism, autonomous individual rights, and privatized morality. And then you couple that with Protestantism, which privatizes faith and therefore privatizes the church, such that the church is one among many voluntary institutions flourishing that may or may not flourish in our culture, but is a voluntary institution, no different from anything else that one might join just as an act of will. And even that I need to define a little bit more carefully so that there's no misunderstanding. Of course, we all understand that a person acting with his or her moral agency is free to join a church or not to join a church as the movement of grace might prompt him or her. But what I mean by, and in that sense, of course, any church is voluntary. No one should be and no one is coerced to join a church. But when in America, what we mean by voluntary, the church as voluntary, and what it means in the liberal tradition is that the church is the product of the wills of its members. It isn't just that it's an institution that one may join as an act of will or not, but rather it's actually created by the act of the will of its members. That Protestantism infects the way even we Catholics think about ecclesiastical matters, because we tend to think that allows us to check our conscience at the church door, and to the extent that we affirm the teaching of the church, it's because we have made that affirmation apart from the teaching of the church. The teaching of the church hasn't informed our conscience. Our conscience just may or may not conform to particular aspects of church teaching. And in that sense, as I wrote an article, and I write a column for the UK Catholic Herald, and a few months ago, I wrote about cafeteria Catholics. And of course, the cafeteria Catholic is sort of for a pejorative that typically, quote, conservative Catholics label sort of liberal Catholics, right? But the fact is that we're all cafeteria Catholics. The question is, what end of the political buffet do we eat from? Because we have a tendency to eat from exclusively from one end of the buffet or the other. And that makes neither of us any less cafeteria Catholics than the other. So when we think about America, and if we think about the possibility of speaking Catholic as a cultural artifact or as a cultural reality in Catholic, it's far more difficult in the U.S. than it would be in Europe, because in the U.S., just as a matter of basic principle, the very principles upon which we are founded, individualism, autonomous rights, privatization of morality, the church as a voluntary organization, all of those are the hallmarks of what it means to be an American, and that has very much influenced the way that even Catholics think about what it means to be a Christian.
Yeah, and maybe just to follow up, I appreciated in the first chapter how you mentioned Alistair McIntyre's perspective on even the use of words, the use of language. Like, there's such a large chasm between kind of the 21st century American liberal and where the faith comes from, in a sense that even the terms that we want to use when we're writing articles and books about the faith are completely impossible to understand, in a sense. Like we're speaking across such a gap that it's just nonsensical.
And that impossibility, you use the word impossibility and nonsensical, and that's exactly right. And for listeners who are not familiar or haven't read the book yet or don't know this famous thought experiment in the first chapter of Alasdair MacIntyre's book After Virtue, he imagines this scenario, this imaginary scenario, in which there's a series of natural disasters that happen in the world, and there's this popular sort of dunderheaded accusation that the scientists who measure reality are actually responsible for causing these disasters. So there's this backlash against science in which laboratories are looted, books are burned, scientists are persecuted, imprisoned, and lynched, and lynched in some cases, and so science is completely eliminated essentially. And then later an enlightened group comes along in a new enlightened era, and it tries to piece together all of those bits and pieces of science that had been so dispersed and burned and torn down and so forth. And what it puts together but it doesn't have any unifying story to give definition to terms and meaning to words. And therefore, what it puts together is this nonsensical, fragmentary thing that it calls science, where you have theories that contradict other theories, trying to share the same textbook and trying to use the same language. And of course, it doesn't make any sense. And we can't, and as MacIntyre says, we can't call it science in any real sense. He says that imaginary state is the real state of moral philosophy. When he wrote this book in 1981, and I don't know, there aren't very many books written in the modern, the contemporary era that have such staying power as After Virtue has and will continue to have, because it really was a sea change. And basically, MacIntyre said that he essentially, and this is a reduction of his reduction, but essentially said that we've reduced morality to emotivism, and once we reduce morality to emotivism, then words mean whatever we happen to say they mean. And so you're exactly right. So people might use the same words, the same phrases, but mean something completely different by them. And what motivated me to write the book is precisely that, because we Catholics use a liberal Protestant vocabulary and syntax and grammar to try to talk to one another. And what we're really speaking is liberal Protestantism. My modest, perhaps quixotic, but modest hope for the book is to get us Catholics to start thinking in Catholic, rather than thinking in liberal Protestantism. And I'll leave it at that for now. But I also use an example from one of my favorite series of novels to illustrate this, if we want to go into it further. But that's a great observation, and I think that really is part of the motivating factor of the book, trying to recover the grammar, the syntax, the language, the vocabulary of Catholicism, so that we Catholics can at least speak to one another. I don't think there's much hope that we can speak to the broader culture in any meaningful way, and that is to say, in any meaningful way that brings to bear our Catholic conviction, if we don't even understand that ourselves.
No, it's bringing up Alasdair MacIntyre. I was very happy to see that in the first chapter of your book. Just from a personal note, I came upon Alasdair MacIntyre's book After Virtue in 2009, when I was a senior in college, and it was just by mistake that I was just browsing the library shelves, and I saw this title After Virtue, and it looked fascinating. So I picked it up, I checked it out, and I was just absolutely captivated, because I think he begins the book with that.
It's the first chapter.
Yeah. And so at the time, I was trying to actually write on some of the questions of it was about the some sexual ethics and marriage problem. I remember at the time in 2009, the marriage debate was a big thing, but it seemed to me that the minute you try to actually defend the marriage from, if you now want to even call it a traditional perspective, you have to argue for it on these liberal grounds. And so exactly. the minute you do that, it's like game over. So just to think, can you say more about this kind of tradition laden understanding of rationality that, because it seems to me that if you have this break with the tradition, how to, in some ways, recover that? It just seems to me that MacIntyre, kind of ends a little bit on, even though he ends with the "Dare we hope for like a new Saint Benedict,"
New
which
Saint Benedict, yeah.
I know he has, like, people have asked him about Rod Dreher and that book, and Alistair McIntyre has said some pretty negative things about that book and does not want to be associated with it. But it seems like, and I have not read McIntyre's latest work, but it seems like there's almost a little bit of a note of despair at the end of the day. So, like, how do we as Catholics, though, think about this tradition-laden understanding of rationality?
Yeah. Well, I think, and let me give you another example as a way to try to get at the answer. And that's an example that I use in my book when we use rights language to defend unborn life. So we talk about a right to life. Now, there certainly is a way of understanding rights as derivative of obligations or duties or derivative of the dignity of the human person. But that's not at all how rights is understood in the United States. In the United States, rights is understood as possessive claims against everyone else. We have a very Hobbesian notion of rights. That and we also have and the conceit of modern liberalism is that it's free from tradition, right? That it has an epistemologically privileged place by which it can make judgments that are free of value, that are free of contingencies, that are free of tradition-laden rationality, pure rationality. Now, of course, I use the Anglo example, but we can take the continental examples as well, from Kant, for example, or Rousseau or others, and we arrive at very similar conclusions. So when we talk about rights in the United States, what we mean are possessive individual claims against one another, whether we can articulate that or not. The average person can't articulate that that's what he means, but that is what he means. Well, what is that other than a tradition-laden rationality? It just happens to be one that denies that it's tradition-laden, but it is, and the tradition is this new modern liberalism. So the question then becomes, how do we overcome it? And you are right that there's a certain sense of despair at the end of After Virtue, but in both his books, and I consider the next two books with that one to be sort of a trilogy, and he's written some since then, but both in Whose Justice, Which Rationality, the next book after Virtue, and then in three rival versions of Moral Inquiry, Encyclopedia, Tradition, and Encyclopedia, Genealogy, and Tradition, he does lay out a more hopeful program. And in fact, I discuss that at least implicitly. I invoke him again at the end of the book when I talk about the possibility of civic friendship. And I think that's the key to the end. And that I'm finally getting, Bobby, to the answer to your question. I think that we Catholic Christians need to have more modest expectations of how it is that we relate to the broader culture. And those more modest expectations might even require us to draw back from any sense or felt need for a rigorous notion of citizenship, much less patriotism, which I think is problematic, is even more problematic. Now, of course, we are citizens by function of law, right? We're citizens by function of being born in the United States, or by function of being, taking a test and being, what's the word I want, naturalized citizens, and all of that. And that's fine. We can talk about the legal function. That's a completely different thing from sort of the spiritual citizenship that kind of requires the kind of devotion that is always dangerous because it can lapse into idolatry. So what I talk about is civic friendship. And I think that the way that we do that, a la McIntyre, is to try to enter in a charitable way, in the same way that we charitably read a text with which we might disagree. We read it charitably in order to give the author the benefit of every doubt, to assume that the author knows what he's talking about, that he's being truthful, that he's competent, and so forth. All of those things might not be true, but a charitable reading of a text starts with all of those presumptions which might be overcome. So what we try to do, I suggest, is develop, rather than citizenship or much less patriotism, because I think that almost always devolves into something other than distinctly Catholic, is to take our Catholic understanding of the human person, society, economics, the family, and so forth, and try to enter into, for purposes of comity, comity, an arrangement by which we can at least try to communicate across those which are otherwise nonsensical, tradition-laden boundaries. And And again, that's not an easy thing to do. And I think part of the reason that After Virtue tends to end with a note of despair is I think MacIntyre himself understood that that's going to be very difficult to do because these competing rationalities are jealous. And that's the thing that we need to understand. Competing tradition-laden rationalities are very, very jealous and protective of their own rationalities. And the most protective one, the tradition-laden rationality that is most jealous of its borders is liberalism. and that's one of the great ironies of liberalism, because it claims to be a procedural, nothing but a set of political procedures, which of course that itself is rooted in a very particular and a very substantive anthropology.
No, that's Andrew, do you want to pick up?
No, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that, to make that explicit, to say that there is an anthropology that is operative here, it just is implicit the whole time is, I think, the first task. But it's so difficult when you're discussing this with someone to even get to the point of that you have a distinctive concept of what a human being is.
And what liberalism tries to do is tell us that it doesn't have a distinctive notion of what a human being is, and so everybody is free to make up his own mind of what that is. I use, and it's not original to me at all, but I use Robert Kennedy and the famous mystical passage from Planned Parenthood versus Casey. In which he talks about creating your own existence. At the heart of liberty is the creating your own existence, and that's that's the substantive view that claims to be merely procedural.
Yeah, and just
I'm sorry, Bobby, I interrupted.
Not that it matters. I think you meant Anthony Kennedy, although Robert Kennedy might have said a similar thing.
I'm sorry. Anthony. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I was really grateful that you pointed us in the direction of that famous line from the Planned Parenthood versus Casey, because I mean, that's just ever since I first encountered it, it's just so haunting.
It's jaw dropping. And what it encapsulates in 25 words everything that is wrong about the way that liberalism frames its anthropology.
Yeah. I know for myself as I guess in shorthand, a convert to Catholicism, although I've been a Christian my whole life, so came into full communion with the Catholic Church. But something that I've talked about with my fellow converts is how we have been kind of encouraged by non-Catholic friends and family members only in as much as we are pursuing what our conscience dictates, right? Like, oh, it's good for you that you've found the church that works for you, or like you've found the place where your views are sort of more mainstream or whatever it may be, which is just and I get it because in a way, and you said it already, Ken, I mean, and you too, Bobby, I mean, we're in the same soup. We Catholics are creatures in this same kind of liberal world. And so that's just an issue that I'm continuing to process for myself as as someone who's come into the Catholic Church, right?
Yeah, what they should be telling you is that you're making a grave mistake. You shouldn't be doing this, right?
Yeah, you're choosing. Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, I used to be an Anglican. Yeah, I mean, Thomas Cranmer went to the stake condemning the Antichrist and all his false teachings, and he meant the Pope. So, it's back then, I guess they understood what was at play, but
what's at stake. Yeah.
Literally, yeah. Let's get into some of the terms, because so you're a moral theologian, and one of the things that I thought was really helpful about your book is the way you get into describing Catholic social teaching.
Yeah.
And just Catholic social teaching is so fraught with slash blessed with, right, terms that are so easy to contort and to kind of try to read only through the lens of liberalism. And maybe the first one to begin with is dignity. So maybe we could start there. What are we getting wrong when we think about that word?
Yeah, it's interesting, Andrew, and I do want to get to your question, but just in terms of the process of writing the book, well, I actually wanted to use the very first chapter, the very first title that I wanted for the book was to have social doctrine in the book someplace, or Catholic social doctrine in the title of the book. And the publisher said, absolutely no way, because no matter what the book says, there's a certain segment of readers, including readers that we want to reach, who are never going to pick that book up for all the wrong reasons, of course. But the fact is that's the case and exactly why you articulated it, because Catholic social doctrine oftentimes gets lumped together with social justice crusaders, and it isn't a way of thinking about morality, but a club to beat people over the head with, and that's a sad thing, because the rich tradition of Catholic social doctrine is, I think, the place that we have to start in trying to rebuild a Catholic vocabulary and language and grammar and so forth. And dignity is the place to start. And what I suggest in the book is that, as an example, going back again to the incommensurability of these moral languages, is that two different people might use the term dignity to arrive at radically different conclusions about things like, for instance, euthanasia, which is really in the news, or physician-assisted suicide, and two different people might argue vociferously that the dignity of the human person, for one person, absolutely militates against ever engaging in physician-assisted suicide, while the other side says the dignity of the human person absolutely lends itself to physician-assisted suicide. And so where do you go from there? So I do begin with dignity, and I there's nothing original to these four pillars of Catholic social doctrine, as I call them. There's nothing original to me about that: dignity, common good, subsidiarity, and solidarity. But I begin with dignity, and I root it in reading of creation, and I have to say that even my reading of the first three chapters of Genesis, so creation and fall, really the first four chapters, the creation, fall, and then Cain and Abel, which I kind of read as a second run at the fall. So we think of the fall as chapter 3, but chapter 4 is sort of a retelling in some sense of the fall. And even the way that Americans read those stories is defective in some ways. Stanley Hauerwas wrote a book many years ago called Unleashing the Scriptures, and one of the first things he opened the book by saying, a lot of people think that America would be better off if everybody had a Bible, or everybody should have a Bible. And he said exactly the opposite is true. He says, I want to take Bibles away from Americans because they don't have the virtues required to be able to read the Bible. And I keep, myself and many others keep nudging Stan and asking, come on over, across the Tiber with us, and you'll be a happier man. And he's never quite done that, but so I rooted in a doctrine of creation and moral agency. And I think that the way that we have to think about dignity, and this would help us to overcome our infatuation with individual rights as well, is to think about dignity as the foundation of moral agency. Because when we use rights language, what we really want to protect is moral agency, but nobody ever calls it that. But if we think about being made in the likeness and image of God, which means the ability to make contrary choices, but the good choice being that which is in conformity with our natural end, all of that is implied by dignity, and that necessarily protects our moral agency, because we can't be coerced to authentically choose the good. We can be coerced to choose a moral object which produces a good outcome, but that's not good if it's not coerced. So if we think about human dignity as the foundation of moral agency, that does the work that rights language does without the individualist baggage that comes with it. And so if you think about the chapter 3 of Genesis, really an American hermeneutic for reading chapter 3 of Genesis is not that it's the fall of the human person, but rather the liberation of the human person. And you actually will hear some people say this. And there's some famous woman Episcopal or Lutheran minister who wears a stole that says, some kind of pro-abortion imagery on the stole. And basically her shtick is to go around the country talking about how God is pro-abortion. And she actually explicitly reads Genesis 3, not as the fall, but as the liberation of the human person. And most American evangelicals don't do that. But in fact, they really do that, because it's this autonomy, this individualist autonomy that are expressed by the man and the woman in the garden, which really is the American way. So, but of course, they lose their dignity, right, when they do that. And part of the sign that they lose their dignity is that they no longer can be transparent with one another in the way that they were before the fall, and that causes, of course, the kinds of the kinds of attention and the kinds of distrust and the kinds of alienation that are endemic to an anthropology that begins with individualism rather than beginning with dignity, and in its really first step outside of dignity, the solidarity of all human persons.
Yeah, it's sort of backwards, right? Like we think in a way, I really like what you said about the fall reading from Genesis, because I mean it really is like we think to ourselves, well, I have dignity, so why shouldn't I eat the apple? I have dignity. I should have knowledge of good and evil. It's my right because I have dignity.
Yeah, exactly. And as I describe in the book, the tree is a metaphor for the ability to choose wrongly. So when we think of the tree, and I think that, and again, especially American evangelicals tend to, well, first of all, they have, as I say in the book, they have a defective understanding of what it means to say something is literally true rather than something else, because, truth is truth. The question that gets confused is how is the truth claim expressed? And a truth claim can be expressed through poetry, fable, literature, and novels and fiction, as well as a truth claim can be made through science and history and so forth. And I think that's a problem as well. So evangelicals want to read it in a certain way that I think does violence to the metaphorical power of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because because the eating of the tree doesn't just represent freedom of choice. That's already there before the eating. Right. What the eating of it does is symbolizes the usurpation of God's authority as God's eternal mind as the source of moral truth.
Yeah, and if people knew anything about the way the church has always read the Bible, which you point out the kind of fourfold process of different levels of meaning to Scripture, I mean, then they would know you can't. It's We're reading the Bible wrong. I didn't know that what you said, the Howard Wass. I know some of his other choice perspectives and quotes, but that's in a way I think that's right. I mean, we've gotten into a lot of trouble reading the Bible wrong, right?
Oh, I think so. I think so. And if we read the Bible through this individualist anthropology and this voluntarist understanding of the church, it obviously we're going to come to conclusions that are in tension with, if not contradicted by, the Catholic understanding of both of those things. Yeah.
No, it's interesting too. You find this even amongst some Jewish American thinkers about the fall. I think it might have been in Leon Cass's telling of Genesis, that the fall is presented as something like an enlightenment, liberation. But kind of going on the next pillar of solidarity of all of humankind. One of the most famous words here in Poland is solidarność.
Of course,
solidarity. And Andrew was talking about earlier about kind of distinctive marks of Christianity within Europe still, but you still in the kind of the political movement, which was much deeper than just a political movement, but which found its kind of, I would say, ultimate expression in the church. They found that most of the leaders of that movement, maybe not Lech Wałęsa anymore. He's a little controversial here in Poland, even though he's made out to be like a god in America. But Solidarność in Poland seems to have a little bit more of that kind of rootedness in something as given that precedes us. That in some ways, I think there's an African proverb that says, I am because we are. And
I like that.
That proverb, it seems to me that gets at the kind of essence of what this is. So in Poland, and you'll find this in the writings of John Paul II too, and maybe you could say something about this, because I've noticed in John Paul II is throughout this book, John Paul II's understanding of the nation, the narod, it's connected to the born, the given, the thing that precedes you, the family, all of this stuff. You don't choose this stuff, but yet you become who you are. You find your destiny, your mission, your person within this prior community. So maybe you could say something about solidarity in are maybe misperceptions and what you outline in the book?
Gosh, that's a long question, and there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm
I'm
really
sorry.
eager to jump into all of it and cover
sorry,
it.
sorry.
No, that's great. It's wonderful. There's so many things that you suggested there that I'm so excited about to dive into. Yeah, with the Polish. In fact, I gave a talk on the book a few weeks ago at a local parish, and I was asked about the experience in Poland and specifically about the solidarity party or solidar notion. And I said, well, you have to understand that in some sense that was just the name of the labor union. So that's a part of it. That's not to say that's all it was, of course, because as you say, it also implies something that makes a prior claim upon us. And I think that's exactly right. That's exactly what solidarity, the Catholic doctrine of solidarity, does. It makes a prior claim upon us, such that we understand that we know who we are. I know who I am because of who you are. And again, that cuts very much against the grain, right, of American individualism, very much against the grain. I mean, that's perhaps solidarity might be the one of the four, maybe common good as well, that most rankles the individualist, rugged individualist ethos of the American notion. And so what I do, going back to Genesis 1 and 2, I tell my students all the time, everything that you need to know is in Genesis 1 through 4 and Breaking Bad and The Godfather. Everything that you need to know. You can throw in a little Seinfeld as well, but anything that comes up, you can find it in one of those places. Well, in Genesis, in both the creation accounts in Genesis, both of them tell in a different way, using a different kind of literature, a story of solidarity, because the human person is not complete in either of the creation accounts until, well, in the first creation account, he's just made, male and female are made in one blow, in one sentence, right? So what it means to be human is already more than one person. And leave aside for now, and we'll leave it aside for this entire podcast, the issue of gender and all of that. That's a completely another kettle of fish that we could get into, but I don't think this is the place. So, but our point is that it's social. So they are male and female. He created them, right? So the human person is created in a community, and what the maleness and the femaleness at this point is incidental to that. And the second creation account, God creates the man, and he can't find a suitable mate for the man. In other words, the man is not complete yet, right? The man is not complete as a human creature yet. His completion comes when the female is created. And of course, Genesis 2 uses this very, colorful language, and there's a couple of puns going on there where the woman comes forth from the man and so forth, Hebrew puns, and all of that is wonderful. But the point is that the solidarity of humankind is expressed very, very strongly, and I think unequivocally in both creation accounts. In the first, where male and female are created as the human person, and then in the second, where the first person, because he's alone, is not complete, and he's not complete until the second person comes along. And I think I quote, I don't know, the reason I say I think I quote Martin Buber in the book is that it might have actually been deleted, in the editing process, because the book, you both had this experience. The book came in too long, and so the editor either said, you delete some stuff or I'll delete it, your choice. So I don't know if I had a short discussion of Martin Buber's book, I and Thou, which itself is an underappreciated book, especially since it's so accessible. It's very, very short and very, very accessible. And of course, that's his point. And that we know one another because in our relationship to one another. And it's not just a relational knowledge. I know that I'm me because I'm not you. That's not it at all. I know that I'm a human person because of my transcendent ability to conceive of you as another human person. And that, I think, is what Buber means by it. And I think that's very much informed by those first two chapters of Genesis. What solidarity does not mean is some kind of imposed top-down imposition of uniformity. And in the United States, that's what people think about, because they think of any notion. There are two possibilities. There's the good possibility individualism, and there's the bad possibility, collectivism. Solidarity belongs to the bad side, and that's one of the things that we need to recover, a definition of solidarity that is not collectivist, but is an expression of the natural state of the human person, and therefore an expression of one of what we sometimes call the three necessary societies. And you invoke this as well, Bobby, and that is the necessary society of politics. Now, as I said, there's a lot to your question. John Paul II very famously, and I discussed this in my chapter on politics, I discussed that very thing that you mentioned about the distinction between nation and state, because John Paul II does that. And one of the issues that I think is that we have to take into account when we talk about the American experience, perhaps unique in the world, certainly unique in the world at the founding, and perhaps still unique, but I very strongly say unique at the time of the founding. The United States is not a nation. If we think about the nation as an assemblage of demographic, linguistic, cultural, deeply rooted historical identifications, the United States is not a nation. It's a state founded upon an idea, and so there's no true possibility of patriotism, which I also discuss in the book, again invoking McIntyre's definition of patriotism. What there is in the U.S. is commitment to a set of political ideas, which is what we use patriotism to describe that, but it really isn't patriotism in the way that it's understood in other cultures, because America really isn't a fatherland. America has father ideas. And to be an American is to subscribe to those ideas rather than to have any kind of organic cultural tie to the land. Now, as I suggest in the book, of course, over 250 years or so, or whatever it is, there tends to arise an American idea, so that I think that you could say that a sense of nationalism or patriotism has begun to overtake us, so that we could say that, well, there is something about calling oneself an American now that there wouldn't have been in 1776, for example. But the fact is, at least in the founding of the nation and the way that most people think about their patriotism, I think most people really do think that it's more about adherence to an idea than love of a geographic, or certainly of any kind of a linguistic or other kind of cultural demographic identification. And that difference is an important one, because since we don't have a patria in the United States in that sense, the state replaces it, and when that happens, that's always dangerous, and that's why we always had this temptation toward idolatry, putting the state in place of more natural kinds of institutions, such as, again, one of these three necessary societies of political life.
Yeah, and then correct me if I'm wrong, Ken, but then the flip side to this, kind of from like I guess we could say the right, would be misconstruing the idea of subsidiarity, which is, ultimate, and maybe you say this in a different place in the book, but this bizarre notion that there's essentially like no natural reality besides the individual, and I don't know what else.
Everything becomes convention. Yeah.
Yeah, or contractual even, I think you say,
Yeah.
So maybe you could say something about that. I mean, it's weird, right? We have these two. We have solidarity and subsidiarity, and it seems like, Democrats like subsidiarity and Republicans like,
right?
Or vice versa, right? Sorry, Democrats like solidarity and Republicans like subsidiarity. But actually, you make the point in the book that, subsidiary. Well, just tell us about. Go ahead into the flip side then. Yeah.
So the first thing that I say is that oftentimes subsidiary is misunderstood by both detractors and its adherents as what we might call Catholic libertarianism. Subsidiary is not Catholic libertarianism. And the reason I say that is virtually any time you hear, at least by, again, what I'll call conservative Catholics, any description of subsidiarity, which they typically like, because they think of it as small government. And what you always hear is, well, subsidiary means this, and then what they'll rattle off is a series of classical conservative liberal, which is not a contradiction, conservative liberal points about limiting the reach of government. without anything to say about, for the purpose of preserving human liberty, without anything to say about the need for the development and flourishing of the human person. Subsidiarity comes from the Latin word subsidium, which of course means to help. It certainly is the case that as early as Pius XI in 1931, in his great encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, said that subsidiarity, an institutional problem should be met on the most proximate and the smallest level possible, and that to do otherwise is a grave moral evil. Now, of course, Pius was writing in it was produced in 1931, so he's writing in the late 20s, early 30s. Marxism and communism is rampant across Europe. Nazism is on the rise in Europe, and both of those ideologies are totalitarian ideologies in which they expressly try to pull everything into itself. Nazism, in some sense, even more than communism, that the state is everything and everything is reduced to the state. So Pius was writing against that in articulating his doctrine of subsidiarity. But what we have to understand is that the primary emphasis on subsidiarity is not proximity and size of the institution, but rather the help that the institution gives to the person in developing as a human person, developing a flourishing moral life as a person. And so what I call for in the book is a reemphasis on subsidiarity as helping institutions, not emphasizing, first of all, size and proximity, but rather emphasizing the degree of help consistent with the preservation of moral agency. And that's the way that we need to understand it. So to the extent that a person needs help in flourishing, and we all do, I'm not here to endorse anything that Hillary Clinton ever said except this: it takes a village to raise a child. Whether or not you liked her policy prescriptions or her husband's policy prescriptions, the title of the book is 100% correct. It takes a village to raise a child. And that's what we call subsidiarity. So we have all kinds of helping institutions, and the measure of those institutions is the degree to which they help a person flourish morally and culturally, but don't take away his moral agency, and that are most efficient in doing that. And of course, that means that oftentimes, in fact, usually it's the case, that small and local is going to be better. But there are lots and lots of problems, social issues and social problems that can only be met by larger institutions or more remote institutions. And just because an institution is remote or large, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a violation of subsidiarity if it's the smallest and most proximate that is able to meet that need to assist in human flourishing, whether it be on a broad cultural scale or on an individual scale. And so what I say is we need to back away from this notion that subsidiarity is just nothing other than a Catholic word for libertarian economics, because it's not that at all. And in fact, the libertarian definition of subsidiarity is woefully inadequate to the task, and it actually even ignores what the word means, because the word means to help. So the primary emphasis for subsidiarity is helping, not the size of the institution that does the help. Important as those are, I don't deny that. But again, the emphasis must be on help, not the size or proximity.
And this connects a little bit to the last pillar with the common good, because oftentimes when I've heard the definition, and even in the Catechism, I think you quote the Catechism, which is quoting Gaudium et Spes, as the definition is always. I remember the first time reading, and I can't recall it, but it was a little bit ambiguous to me, a little bit not ambiguous, but maybe I was wishing for a much more of a robust definition. The Catechism
describes that as a set. I don't have it in front of me, but the set of conditions that allows for the human flourishing, or something like that. And it is more ambiguous than that. In fact, if that were the definition, that as the way that I just articulated, I would perhaps like it a little bit better. I agree with you. The definition in the Catechism, I do cite it, and I do try to interpret it in terms that I think is more fulsome. One of the things that is similar to subsidiarity, we can't think about oftentimes, and again, going back to Andrew's point earlier, the common good is a term that Democrats like and Republicans hate, right? So, and libertarians hate with a white hot passion, because they hear common good and they think, collectivism and centralized government and all of those things. And of course, that's not at all what the common good means. What the common good means is the set of social conditions that do indeed allow for the human person to flourish in a way that's consistent with his nature and consistent with both his natural and supernatural end. So I admit in the book that common good is very difficult to define, and therefore, I think that catechism can be excused somewhat because it is so difficult to define. So what I do is I punt a little bit, and I say, here's one way to think about the common good. The common good is what obtains when a proper notion of dignity, subsidiarity, and solidarity are all observed in our social institutions. The result would be common good. So, I confess that that's punting a little bit, but I do think that helps us get to it. In other words, if we are able properly to define and institute in our social structures, laws and regulations and so forth, proper definitions of dignity, solidarity, and subsidiarity, then I think that the common good would follow, because all of those are constitutive elements of, at the end of the day, what the common good is. We can define, there are other ways of defining it, goods such that their dispersion does not diminish. So goods that can be shared without being diminished. I think that's a good, helpful way of approaching the definition of common good, but it really isn't complete either. What we do have to reject, however, is the notion that the common good is nothing other than the conditions that make it possible for everybody to pursue their own individual goods, because all that's doing is instituting the city of the principles of the earthly city and calling them principles of the city of God. And obviously that's a difficulty.
Yeah, I don't, the image of the common good that I often just have in my mind is when I'm walking into Old Town Krakow and I come upon the main square, and where everybody in some ways out there, either walking around admiring the beauty or just at the, cafe drinking. And it seems like everybody, and there might be a concert going on, but everyone in some way is partaking in the various goods that are there in the city. And it doesn't seem like anyone in some ways taking something away from another necessarily, but they're all in some ways beholding something, maybe something like a beatific vision, which everybody beholds, but beholds this. And I'm wondering if, with the state notion of being ordered to serving the common good, in the modern context, and I'm trying to actually recall the language here, but I'm not sure if this is explicitly said in Hobbes or Locke, that it's a kind of a definite break from using common good language as the kind of end and purpose of what the state is there to serve.
Yeah, it is Locke, and so because for Locke in the Second Treatise, the state is to preserve human liberty, not common good. Very different definition of government, and you make a really good point, because I've already gotten, and we'll get more pushback on the book as sort of just maybe a weakened manifesto for integralism or however it's pronounced. I hear it pronounced all over the place, and indeed I cite a couple of integralist or integralist authors in the book as examples of somebody that we need to pay attention to. But I think that's very interesting what some people like Patrick Renine and Adrian Vermeulen and Chad Pecknold and others, Father Wallenstein. I think it's all very, very interesting and all very important. Thomas Pink. I think what they're writing is very important, and I think it's very important that we understand it. Obviously, its detractors usually set up a straw man of what it is and then knock down the straw man without ever even addressing what integralism is all about. But I would suggest this, Bobby. It's that we can have a notion of the state being informed by the goods of Catholic moral doctrine without even remotely approaching anything like some kind of a confessional state. I mean, that's possible to do. And because we can articulate principles that are derived from our understanding of what the human person is, properly speaking, what society is, what the family is, and so forth, those can be instituted in a state that is not a confessional state, even though they are informed by Catholic faith and thought. Now, that might seem to imply that I'm saying that integralists advocate a confessional state, and I think that I think you can get 3 integralists in a room and get 5 different opinions on whether or not that's the case. But I think you're right, and I know that Poland and Hungary to a lesser extent, because Hungary is not really Catholic, where in its more popular ethos, but where Poland is. But I hear Poland identified oftentimes in very similar to the way that you just described it. But I also think that other than just the sense of this ethos, we also have to think about social institutions, practical social institutions that serve the common good or don't serve the common good. And we can identify the ones in the United States which certainly and obviously don't. Legalized physician-assisted suicide, abortion, obviously, surrogacy, even, and you talk about, Europe. Europe has a very different understanding and position on almost across the continent on surrogacy than the United States does. And of course, the Pope, the Dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith, has addressed that just a couple of days ago as we record this in this new document on dignity. So we can talk about the common good in the sense that you describe it, and I think that's all well and good, and I endorse that. But we also have to think about social institutions, legal, regulatory, and political institutions that also contribute to our ability to achieve that sense of human flourishing that we call the common good. And that's a difficult thing to do. It's especially difficult when we begin with this individualist ethos that recoils at any notion of the common good, again, as nothing other than another word for collectivism or top-down, social engineering and whatnot.
Yeah, I appreciate all of that, Ken. And in fact, I wanted to end on kind of where do we go from here, kind of practical implications. And you've already invited us a long way down that path. But maybe for just the very end, our institution is called Spe Salvi. We are trying to articulate hope, which is not the same thing as optimism. And in fact, we're pretty pessimistic about a lot of things, right, Bobby? Mm-hmm. But we are really, in some respects, for me anyway, I am really interested in picking up this project that I think was trying to make sense of the brokenness of the world in between World War I and World War II that was then kind of smashed to greater bits because of World War II. But basically, like, how do we sort of come back in modernity to the possibility somewhere down the line that we really could have a Christian society? And it seems to me like, what you articulate in your book is so important to that prospect. I'm just wondering what maybe I'll say one more thing and then throw it back to you. To come all the way back to what we were talking about at the beginning with Alistair McIntyre. I mean, some people read the end of After Virtue as the solution is run for the hills, maybe try to cultivate these little secluded communities or something. And I think I'm all for that. But I don't know, maybe I'm too worldly. I don't know. But I want to engage. If it comes to a fight, maybe, not violent, but, really hash this stuff out. So I don't know, where does your hope lie with a lot of this stuff?
Well, first of all, like you, I'm hopeful but not optimistic. So I think I think I agree with you on that. I think that and also I think that if we think about the so-called Benedict option, which is McIntyre doesn't use that phrase. Obviously, that's Rod Dreher's phrase and the name of the book. But if we think about what McIntyre actually does suggest, it isn't run for the hills, and it is not creating discrete, separate political communities. Rather, the Benedict option, if we want to use that phrase, is more about trying to cultivate a linguistic community that can articulate a hopeful vocabulary consistent with the desire and the heartfelt attempt to be able to communicate across that. And the last page of my book basically says that. And basically, maybe the best that we can hope for now, at least, is to develop a politics of civic friendship. But we Catholics, before we can do that, we first have to learn to speak Catholic ourselves, and then suggest how that can that can be articulated into a theory of civic friendship. And so it's a modest claim. The book makes very modest claims. I want Catholics to read it. And in fact, we even talked about the marketing of the book, because we've already limited our marketing possibilities by putting Catholic in the title. But that's okay, because I at least want Catholics to read the book, and at least want Catholics to start thinking about what it means to think and speak Catholic in a way that we have lost, and to try to back away from this identification of partisan loyalty as somehow the source of our moral lives. So I don't know if that really answers your question, Andrew, but I think that I think it would be a start, and I actually think it would do some good. And I'm very blessed and honored, and knock wood, to be teaching at a very vibrant seminary with just tremendous group of young men, both from the Archdiocese of Cincinnati and others across the country, including about half of our men or so are from the Diocese of Charlotte, North Carolina. So they send all of our men to us. I am extremely hopeful and extremely optimistic, at least in my corner of the church, and therefore my corner of America, for producing men who are starting to get this, and who are starting to understand that we need a sort of ressourcement in our understanding of what it means to be Catholic, and who are backing away from identifying what it means to be Catholic with what it means to be American. And I think that's the hope. And if we are going to be hopeful, it has to be along those lines. There's no hope in trying to make America be better at being America. As I've said many times, the antidote for liberalism is not more liberalism.
Yeah, amen to all that, Ken. That's great stuff. The book is Citizens Yet Strangers, Living Authentically Catholic in a Divided America. Ken Craycraft. Sorry, I knew I was going to stumble on your name sooner or later. Ken Craycraft, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, and I would be scolded by my publisher if I didn't throw in. I don't know what kind of graphics are going to go up when you produce this, but the book is available from OSV Books, our Sunday visitor, osvbooks.com. I think shipping is free, or of course it's available from Amazon or Barnes and Noble or wherever you buy books. But yeah, I hope after viewing this podcast, you'll take up the book and consider these thoughts that I have there, and maybe start to rethink the way we think about our Catholic language and vocabulary.
For sure. Everybody get a copy. And everybody, please also rate our podcast, give us a good 5-star review, share it, subscribe, and check out our website, spacesalviinstitute.com. Sign up for our emails so you don't miss anything new like this podcast when it goes out. Until next time, God bless and live in hope.